Well, my name is Michael Ninness. I am on the XD product management team. My team focuses on the design and prototyping features of XD. There's a whole other team that focuses on the collaboration features. So we have a lot in our product, and we have a lot more to do, but we've come a long way as well. How many of you have been with XD since the beginning? From Comet days, Sparkler days, early days, okay? So this is our third public release. It's our third birthday. We released version 1 in 2017. And we do monthly releases. For those of you who've actually adopted XD in your workflow, you'll see that you get notifications on a regular clip. We bring new features every month on average there. A couple things to point out. If you want more tips throughout the year, I encourage you to follow Elaine and Howard Pinsky on Twitter. Howard is the genius behind letsxd.com, where he's publishing new tutorial videos every week for the most part. So he's a great resource to follow, letsxd.com. Howard Pinsky or Pinsky on Twitter. Elaine posts a new power tip almost every day on Twitter as well. And then my Twitter handle's there as well. I'm not as frequent as them, but I do share tips there as well. So we have a lot to cover today. It's tips, tricks, and techniques. I'm going to walk you through a lot of different areas and design features, prototyping features, components, states, preview on mobile. If we have time, would you guys be interested in a sneak peek of something that's coming? Yes. Okay. Encourage your instructor. If he likes your encouragement, he'll give you a sneak peek. Some stuff that didn't quite make it in the Max release, but coming soon. And I can give you a little sneak peek of that. All right, so why don't we just begin and just shove as many tips and tricks and shortcuts down your throats as much or into your brains as possible in the time that we have. For those of you who've been here from the beginning, just know that you may know some of these tips already, and that's okay. I'm sure there'll be some that you don't know, so just be patient and wait for the other folks who maybe didn't know what you already knew. And then remember, the less you know, the more important I feel. So there you go. All right, so first we'll just do some basic navigation keyboard shortcuts. Command 0, it's pretty standard. That's fit all the artboards into view. So I use that one all the time. Command 1 is 100%. I don't actually find that very helpful because it always zooms you into somewhere where then you can't tell where you are. That happened to you guys? You're panning around trying to figure out what artboard am I on. So you then do Command 0 again to try to orient yourself. So what I like to do instead is if you click on the ... the ellipses for a particular artboard, if you want to zoom in on that artboard as big as possible, then the keyboard shortcut for that is Zoom to Selection, Command 3 or Control 3 on Windows. So, and that works on whatever you have selected. It doesn't mean just an artboard. It can mean an individual object. Command 3 can mean a selection of things across artboards. So I'll select those 4 texts across those artboards. Again, Command 3. Just whatever you have selected will fit as large as possible on your screen with Command or Control 3. If you're familiar with the Layers and Assets panel, there's actually a hidden navigation shortcut there as well. Obviously, if you click on the name of an artboard, it's going to select that artboard, and you can double-click to change its name. But if you double-click on the little tiny icon to the left of the artboard name in the Layers panel, then you'll actually zoom up to that artboard as well. And if you click the little back chevron, that goes back to the Fit to All view. Okay, so you can dive in and out by name. How many of you actually name your artboards? Yes, the people that you share your XD documents with love you. Yeah. How many of you really don't like getting files from other people because they don't name their layers, they don't name their artboards? It's Object 1, Object 2, copy 3 of Object 7, right? Very, very helpful. So name your artboards, name your layers, public service announcement. Your colleagues will love you. All right, so anyway, double-click on the little icon to the left of a layer name or artboard name. Click the little back chevron to go back and forth. Just an alternate way to go about that. And again, the favorite navigation keyboard shortcut for me is Command or Control 3, Zoom to Selection. OK, talking about layers. So if I double-click on a particular artboard and zoom to Command 3, and I select an object on that artboard, I'm now seeing a contextual layers panel. It takes a little bit you getting used to if you're switching from, let's say, Illustrator or Photoshop, where the layers panel shows you all the layers in the document. With XD, it's always contextual. And if you want to go actually rename your layers, there's a nice, easy way to do that as well. So if you've got a bunch of layers that you want to name all in one go, if you double-click on a particular layer and change its name, if you hit the Tab key, that will confirm that particular edit and jump you to the next layer to go ahead and give it a name. So something, if you want to rename a bunch of layers all at once, just Tab, Tab, Tab to go from layer to layer to layer. Name your layer, hit Tab again to go to the next one, type your name as well. Then Shift-Tab goes backwards. So pretty standard stuff, but again, one of those little secret ones. If no one's shown it to you, maybe you didn't know it was there. Okay, speaking of the layers panel, there's layers and assets. How many of you would like to see layers and assets side by side at some point? Okay, we're working on it, trust me. We don't have that yet, so for now it's either or. You toggle back and forth between them. In the bottom left-hand corner, you've got obviously the icon navigations to go back and forth between those, but you also have keyboard shortcuts as well. So Command-Y will toggle open and close the layers panel, or Control-Y in Windows, and then Command-Shift-Y or Control-Shift-Y will toggle the assets panel open. So you can go back and forth via the keyboard shortcuts, if that's your thing. Anyone dream in keyboard shortcuts? You drop your keys, you think Command-Z? That was funny, you'll get that on the way home. All right, so let's talk about guides and smart guides and whatnot. Okay, so XD has some pretty smart guides. We actually shipped with smart guides before we actually had Artboard Guides and ruler guides. That was another long feature request that we shipped earlier this year. But in terms of just smart guides, as you move around, obviously you get the cyan and pink measurements. The cyan guides are letting you know that you're snapping to something of interest, the top, bottom, or middle, another object, or an actual edge. You get collision detection there as well. And then the pink guides just give you dynamic measurements as you're moving things around. The object, what's the distance away as you're moving. Now sometimes the dynamic guides, the smart guides actually get in the way. You're actually trying to move something very close to another object and it keeps snapping. You don't want it to be touching, but it just keeps snapping there. So if you want to temporarily disable the smart guides as you're moving something around, just hold down the Command key on Mac or Control on Windows. And now you can see I can get real close without it snapping, and I've actually turned off all those pink and magenta guides. Let go of the Command or Control key, and they come right back. So that's just disabling the smart guides there. Once you have something selected, if you want to get those measurements, those pink measurements in reference to your selected object, that's the Option or Alt key. And you have to have something selected. So if I don't have an object selected, I hold down Option or Alt, nothing happens. If I select an object and then hold down Option or Alt on Windows, I get the relative measurements for that object and the things that are within its line of sight. So if I were to move that here and then hold Option, I now get a measurement guide. I can also select two objects and get the measurements with a bounding box and so forth. So anyway, anytime you want the active measurement guides, just down Option or Alt on a selected item. Okay, let's keep going with Artboard Guides. Again, this is something that shipped earlier this year, and people still are not necessarily finding that we have this feature, because how many of you actually keep looking for under the View menu, turn on rulers? Yep, there's no rulers. You don't need no stinking rulers. So guides can be created from any edge, left or top edge of an artboard. So if I hover out to the left-hand side of a particular artboard, it's kind of hard to see there. Well, that's interesting. I'm not getting the hover area. Oh, because I've got two guides turned off. Okay, my bad. All right, when Show Guides is turned on, I turned it off in practice here. If you hover over to the left edge or the top edge of an artboard, you get a little light gray highlight there with a little, your cursor changes. So you can click and drag out a guide from top and bottom. So if I want to drag out my guides here, and those are per artboard guides. So you may set up a guide system on one artboard and you want to get those guides on any other artboard. That's easy to do as well. Under the View menu, you can go to Guides and say Copy Guides once you have the artboard selected. Copy Guides. And then if you want to apply those to any other artboard, you can just select them. And I'm going to select 2 artboards here. And paste will paste in the same place across all your selected artboards. Okay? As you're dragging a guide, you'll get dynamic rulers. So if you see at the top there, you see the pink guides there, that's telling you the distance on either side that the artboard guide is in relation to the canvas. So you always get that reference information without actually taking up screen real estate with actual rulers. Wow, that's great, Michael. Thanks for showing us that. I'm so excited to be here. You guys having a good time? Yeah, tell your faces about it. I see a lot of this. Smile, it's good. All right, so that's guides, artboard guides. Let's talk about grids as well. So zoom up to size here. I'm going to turn on my square grid. You have a layout grid and a square grid in XD. And of course, there's keyboard shortcuts for that. Command apostrophe or command quote, whatever that key is called, that turns on and off your square grid. And command semicolon will turn on and off your guides if you have them. So I'm going to turn the square grid on. The default size of your square grid is 8 pixels. That may not necessarily be the right size for you. We'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to zoom up on this particular object. You can see it's not aligning to that pixel grid yet, that 8-unit grid. So now that I've got this object selected and I've got my grid turned on, just like in any other design product, you can use your arrow keys to nudge objects. And right now it's just nudging 1 pixel at a time, right? So I'm going to nudge it to where it actually falls on the actual grid. If I move it by hand, you'll see that it always snaps to the square grid point. Okay, so there it's lined up. If I use my arrow keys, it's moving 1 pixel at a time in the direction I press. How do you do something 10 times, right? You hold down Shift with the arrow keys, right? But watch what happens. If I do Shift, arrow key, you guys see what's happening now? It's not moving 10 pixels, it's moving the grid unit, right? So this is something we changed just recently, about a month ago. If you have your square grid turned on the artboard, so let's zoom out a little bit. Okay, I've selected the artboard. In the properties panel for the artboard selected, my grid size is 8. I'm going to change that to 16. You can change it to whatever number works for you. I'll zoom in on that object again. And now, when I use my arrow keys, with just arrow keys by themselves, it's still 1 pixel at a time. But if I add Shift to the arrow keys, the first time you do Shift in an arrow key, it will snap to the closest grid point. So now it stays on the grid. And from now on, Shift and an arrow key will always move that object to the next grid unit. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yep, pretty fun. But wait, there's more.
Does that fix the point?
The aligned of the half pixel issue?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question for the recording was, does that fix the half pixel issue? We actually fixed that even earlier this year. It's not something you have to do. Now, if you have an object that is not on a whole pixel, it doesn't retroactively change those objects. So you can choose the align to pixel grid option for that particular thing. But starting 3 or 4 months ago, every new object you create with your rectangle tool, your shape tools, they will always be whole pixels. And now every time you resize a group or a component or a selected set of objects, they'll always scale in whole pixel now. Yeah, you'll only see that issue for your older documents. Yep. Okay, so that was nudging to the grid. In order to get it to snap to that particular grid unit, you just have to have the grid turned on for that artboard, that square grid. So that's nudging. You can also resize with your arrow keys as well. So instead of Shift for multiplying by 10, if you hold down the Command key or the Control key in Windows, watch the right-hand side. You see how it's not lining up with the grid yet? Okay, it's off grid. If I Command arrow key, it goes 1 pixel at a time. I'm actually scaling or resizing that object 1 pixel at a time. If I add Shift to that, so when in doubt, hold down the entire left-hand side of your keyboard. Command Shift and the arrow keys will now scale or resize that to the next grid point. Can anyone tell me why this is scaling intelligently? Because I've got responsive resize turned on as well. We'll talk about that in a little bit for those of you who don't know it. But responsive resize is turned on for selected objects by default. So as you see that I'm scaling this now by holding the Command and Shift and then using my arrow keys, the objects themselves are laying themselves out according to the constraint rules that responsive resize automatically detects. Okay, So how do you get it to align with your square grid? You just change the pixel value for your square grid amount. We had changed it to 16. If I go back to the Artboard selection and go to my Properties panel, I can change that to whatever increment I'm using for my particular grid. If I want to change it back to 10, change the grid unit, excuse me, and now when I move that object, we're using my nudge keys. If I do Shift, it always snaps to the next grid increment. If it's off the grid when you start, Shift will snap it to the next grid point. And then to scale, it's Command and Shift together to scale on the grid. OK, cool. Hopefully that was new information for you. It's like, yay, that's fun. But wait, there's more. I definitely feel the post-lunch lull in this room. Y'all have like pasta? Turkey, all right. Celebrating Thanksgiving a little early. All right, let's talk about opacity shortcuts. I'm sure some of you grew up with Photoshop and probably know those keyboard shortcuts there. We've mimicked them to be the same in XD. So I've got this object selected, and I want to play with its opacity value. With just it selected, I don't have to press any other modifiers. I can just press a number. So if I type the 5 key, it changes the opacity of that object to 50%. If I type in 8, it's 80%. You get the drill. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Just like in Photoshop. 1 through 0. 0 takes it back to 100%. 1 is 10%, so from left to right. 10% increments. If you want to go to have a little bit more fine control, you can do single-digit increments by typing 2 numbers quickly. So if I type 5, 5, I get 55%. If I do 6, 6, that gives me 66%. Just don't type 666. That reformats your hard drive. Man, that joke is so old. All right, so you can change the opacity of any selected object or objects just by using numbers on your keyboard. Last month, we actually added blend modes to XD, a long requested feature. So let's go ahead and draw a rectangle around this particular object here. Let's go to the border, and we'll give it a nice, ugly green color. Not too toxic there. All right, I'm going to move that back. And what I want to do now is change the blend mode so that it blends and composites down to that grayscale image and actually changes its color. So how many of you are like me in Photoshop or Illustrator or InDesign, wherever blend modes show up, and you're like, you have no idea what these blend modes do? And you're like, was it that one? Nope. Was it that one? Nope. Was it that one? Nope. Oh, maybe it was that one. I don't know. You're constantly going back to that drop-down menu because you haven't memorized what each one blend mode does. There's a better way. Shift and Option on the Mac, Shift Alt on PC. The plus button, Shift Option plus, will cycle you through to the next blend mode. So you can just keep cycling until you like the look you want. Shift Option minus goes backwards in the list. And the crowd went wild. Wow, that's awesome. Ah, you're learning, see? I need encouragement. All right. Okay, so blend modes, you can click them by choice if you know the one that you want. And if you just want to play around and experiment, Shift Option plus and minus to go forward and backwards in the list. Okay. All right, another feature that we shipped recently, it's going to be the theme of the session. We just shipped this, we just shipped that. We're shipping this next. We added edit in Photoshop capability. So for any placed bitmap image, whether it's a JPEG, a PNG, or you've placed a Photoshop file and it's been converted for you, you can right-click on it and choose Edit in Photoshop in the contextual menu. Either if you're on Windows, you can right-click, or second mouse button click, whatever it is. And on Mac, same thing, right-click. I'm going to edit in Photoshop. And what this does is this creates a temporary file for you. Let me move this down. Windows Zoom. There we go. I can do anything I want to this image now, so I'm going to go ahead and do an edit where I want this moon to be a little bit more atmospheric or red, like a blood moon. So I'm going to add a hue and saturation adjustment layer to that. I'm going to click on the little magic finger to dial in the particular color I want to change, make it a little bit more red, and choose increase the saturation. Maybe make it a little bit more there, and then change the lightness. So I've done a pretty drastic edit. Wow, it's really blown out up there. Okay. So anyway, I'm going to save that. close it. Or actually, I'm going to leave it open for now. I'm going to save it and come back to XD. And as you would expect, we've been doing this for years between applications. It automatically updates that and replaces it with the edited version. If I don't like that edit, I can right-click and choose Edit in Photoshop again. As long as this file is still open, I still have access to the layers that I added during this editing session. So I can go back and turn that off. I can edit it again because it's a non-destructive adjustment layer. I can tweak it a little bit more and so forth, or whatever I want to do. All right. And then I'll just turn it off for now. When I save it again and come back to XD, it'll automatically update that for me again. Now, if I close that Photoshop document, remember, it's a temporary file that it's sending, and what ends up happening is that it then flattens that result back in XD and replaces it as a PNG file, right? If you want to retain access to the actual layers, then what you'd want to do is put that layered composition in a CC library, and then you can drag that layered composition from Photoshop or Illustrator or whatever into XD. That will maintain a link to that original layered file, and if you edit it via the CC library route, then you retain those layers. So Edit in Photoshop, as it exists now in XD, is really just for those quick retouching tasks. Maybe you want to use content aware fill and get something out, like a light pole or something, or you just want to tweak the color really quick. So that's the intention or the use for Edit in Photoshop. But wait, there's more. Okay.
Better to start in Photoshop.
Say it again?
So that it's better to start in Photoshop and then you drag it into XD so that you have your file ready.
So the question was, I'm going to paraphrase, what's better to start in Photoshop or XD or whatever? It doesn't really matter. The question is, do you want to retain access to that layer stack, right? If you've got a layered Photoshop file that you want to bring in XD, when you open a Photoshop file, XD actually converts those layered those layers in Photoshop into XD layers, and it doesn't maintain a connection to that layered PSD anymore. Okay, it's actually a conversion process. Same thing when you open up an Illustrator file or open up a sketch file in XD. We're actually converting that object stack into XD native objects. If you want to maintain a connection to the layered Photoshop file or Illustrator file, you don't open it in XD. You place that layered composition in a CC library. Then you open up your CC Libraries panel in XD, and if you've got that asset, it'll sync and you just drag it in. And now you're maintaining a connection between those layered native files. Does that make sense? Yep. Okay. All right, so continuing on with just some design shortcuts. When you draw rectangles, of course, you've got on-object widgets for controlling the rounded corners. Pretty standard stuff. But if I want to change just one corner, then what you'd do is you'd hold down Option or Alt on Windows. So I'd grab any corner handle. Let me zoom in here real quick so you can see a little bit better. And if I grab one rounded corner handle, so there's the object handle, then there's the rounded corner handle. If I Option drag or Alt drag on Windows, I'm changing just that one corner. If I look on the Properties panel, I'll see that there's 4 fields now for rounded corners when I have that object selected. And just as a visual, and it's kind of hard to see, maybe I'm projecting up there, but if you take a look at this icon and I tab, there's a subtle little feedback to tell you which corner it's referencing, because sometimes I don't memorize what's the first field, what's the second field, what's the third field. So top left, top right, bottom left. See, it's hard to remember that. So that gives you that little indicator. So that's just another way that you can control the corner radius individually, or you can do it directly on canvas by Option or Alt dragging. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the live Pathfinder. How many of you used Pathfinder operations in Illustrator before, right? Exclude, difference, things like that. It's a little bit different in XD in the sense that they're non-destructive. There's a way to do that in Illustrator, but you have to use the appearance panel, and it has to be a live transform effect, if some of you know how to do that or not. But in XD, it just works that way naturally. So if I draw a circle here, and draw another overlapping circle, because I want to take a bite out of something, and make like a real quick logo of some sort. All right, so make that a solid fill. I'm going to select these 2 objects, and in the Properties panel, I'm going to use the intersect to get that composite shape, or I'll just use the other one, the exclude, or this one as well. So whatever option you want. it looks like you've ended up with a destructive operation, right? There's the union of those particular shapes. But if I double click on that object, you'll see that I actually still have access to the shapes I used to make that composite object, which means I can go back and edit that live path operation anytime I want. How many of you didn't know that? It's pretty killer, right? So if you're trying to construct a logo and you're just trying to fine tune it, you still have access to all the shapes you use to make that composite. So this is actually 4 circles. If I double click and double click again, I can just keep diving in and get into the layer stack of that particular composite object, and it's all live. So as I reposition those objects, I'm updating that composite. And if I look at the layers panel, I can actually have access to the objects that way as well. So if I collapse that group and click on its little folder in the layers panel, I can see that this is the live pathfinder. It's created kind of a special group within this group. And that's what that little icon there means. And it gives you the name of the pathfinder operation you used. If I click on that again, I see the individual objects that were used to actually create that. Now what's crazy about that is that you can do all sorts of cool animation effects. Like let's say you've built a logo in XD using some of these operations, and you want to kind of do a quick animation to have those component parts animate together. So I'm just going to duplicate this artboard, drag it over to the right, Option drag to duplicate. And I'm going to go to prototype mode, and I'm going to wire this artboard, the original artboard, to the second artboard, change its transition from its action from transition to Auto-Animate. How many of you have used a timeline before and liked it? Yeah, more hands went down. Good. In XD, you can do animation without a timeline, and we kind of think of it as visual keyframing, right? You change what you want your artwork to look like in the first keyframe, right, on one artboard. On the second artboard, you just change it to what you want it to end up as, right? So it's first keyframe, second keyframe, and then Auto-Animate's going to go ahead and interpolate and figure out that tweening for you. So back on this first artboard, I'm going to go back to the design mode. I'm going to dive into that circle, that composite shape, get access to the individual objects, and I'm just going to move them wherever I want. The second artboard still has them in their original position, and if I want, I can change this one's opacity. I'll just change that to, say, 20% to start out light, turn off the border. And then I'll go into my preview mode. I can do that by pressing the play button up at the top, the desktop preview, or I can hit Command Return to open up the preview window. And my trigger is a tap or a click. So if I click, I can see that logo coming together just by animating the composite shapes that were used to create that particular object. Wow, that was really fun. Thanks, Michael. Now I'm having to beg for applause. You're making me feel, you're not doing so well on that sneak opportunity. Just keep in mind, I'm paying attention. All right. Let's talk about responsive resize real quick. Like I said earlier, it's on by default. It's not anything you have to turn on. If you select any group of objects, whether it's a physical group that you've actually done a Command G to, or it's just a selection, you'll notice in the Properties panel, the little widget for responsive resize is actually toggled on by default. Now, XD does a pretty good job, about 80 to 90%. The goal was 80 to 90% of the time that you resize something with responsive resize, you're going to get the result that you expect. It's actually taking a look at the layout of your content and paying attention to whether things are grouped or not, what their relative position is to the edges of the container it's in, and so forth. And as I move a resize handle, it's automatically figuring out what those constraints are. How many of you use pinning? You know, if you come from Sketch or some other product, there's these really complex pinning UIs, and you have to figure out what all the rules are. The goal here in XD was that only have to do that when you really, really need to fine-tune control over something. So here's another example. I've got my artboard selected. By default, responsive resize is not turned on for artboards. It is for groups and selections, but if you've selected the entire artboard, it's not turned on. So some people get a little tripped up by that. They select the artboard, they go resize the artboard handle, and they're like, wait, what happened to responsive resize? It's just turned off by default for the artboard level. If you turn it on, it now stays sticky for that particular artboard. It's an attribute of that artboard now. So if I deselect and come back to that artboard, you'll see that toggle still on. So it's an artboard level attribute. Now when I grab the Artboard handle, you'll see that I'm getting responsive resize behavior automatically. Has anyone not run into this yet? By it being on by default, except for the Artboard, we're hoping you're just not even realizing that there's this magic happening. You're just getting the result that you expected, okay? So you can see that book tickets button is getting wider. All the text is staying anchored where it's supposed to be staying anchored. That button in the middle, the pause button, is staying anchored in the center, and everything's just growing the way it should. Okay, but every once in a while, it doesn't quite do what you thought it would expect to do. So here I've got a form, and I want to make it a little bit wider for an iPad, let's say. So again, I've got my artboard selected, and I've got the little toggle turned on for that particular artboard, and you'll see that everything's looking pretty good except those first names and last name fields. They're staying a fixed size, right? They're anchored correctly, but they're not resizing like the other foreign fields are below them, okay? So if that ends up happening, if you're just not getting it quite the result you want, simply undo the last responsive resize motion that you did, and then double-click to dive in and select the particular object that you need to adjust. So here I've got the last name field object selected, and in responsive resize, in the properties panel, the default again is set to auto. If I turn it on to manual, now you've got that classic pinning UI, and you can change the rules here. So for this particular button, I don't want it to stay, or this field, I don't want it to be a fixed width. I want it to be able to grow and scale and get wider. So I'm gonna just turn off the fixed width option for that particular object. And I'll go back to the first name field, again go to manual, and I'll turn off fixed width again for that particular object. I'll go back to the artboard level, and now when I resize, the first and last name fields are acting the way I want them to. So again, most of the time, you get the result you need on the first try. If something looks a little bit off, just undo, dive into the structure of your object, select the objects that you want to adjust, and then switch it to manual in the properties panel and change the rule set there. Okay. Yeah. Someone's learning. Yay. Somebody really wants a sneak peek. This is good. All right. So it's on by default, which is good most of the time, but every once in a while, we'll get help emails or user voice requests, and when it's like, I don't understand what's happening when I'm scaling this object. It's like possessed or something. So here's a good example. Here is an SVG file that I've placed from the Noun project. And again, responsive resize is turned on by default. So how many of you have experienced this? Everybody. And you're like, what the? What is this, a bug? What is that? It's not a bug. It's just that responsive resize is turned on, okay? So because this is a group of objects, but it's grouped a certain way, and you would expect it to scale a certain way, this is when you don't want the responsive resize behavior to not happen. So one trick is, of course, just turn it off for an SVG selection like that. And now it does it normally. And if you want to constrain it so it scales proportionally, we just hold the shift key down. But it's much simpler than that. I'm gonna leave it on to temporarily disable responsive resize, right? Instead of having to remember to go turn that toggle on and off. If you just hold down the shift key as you scale a handle or grab a handle and resize it, that will turn off responsive resize while you're dragging, while you're holding down that shift key, okay? For some, that was worth the price of this session alone. Just trying to figure out, did XD become possessed? Nope. We're working on actually having smarter defaults so that you don't have to remember to hold the shift key down, so that'll come in a future release. We want it to behave so that if you have an SVG selected, it auto-detects that and just does what you expect, right? Would you guys like that better? Yeah. All right. Okay, so for now, when you want to disable responsive resize, don't go back to the properties panel and actually turn the toggle on and off. Just hold down shift to override that and turn it off. And here's another example. I already did this with the live path operations animation. But this is where the behavior of responsive resize for SVGs actually comes in handy when you want to do some sort of special build animation, or if you're using XD for presentations, you want to have a fly-in logo type effect. So again, I'm going to duplicate this artboard, go to prototype mode, wire these two up, change the action to auto-animate. You saw me do that earlier. I'm going to go back to this particular object. I'm going to scale it with responsive resize turned on. I'm going to hold down the Option key so it scales from the center. Kind of have things go off the artboard there. I'll lower the opacity so it's going to fade in as well. I'll change it to 0. And then I'll go to my preview window, Command Return, tap, and there you go. I don't know if that was pretty fast. Oh, there you go. If you want to change the timing of that, if I go back to prototype for that selected artboard and select that wire, the default duration of an auto-animate is 0.3 seconds, so it's pretty fast. I'm going to just change that to 1 second. You can change it manually up to 5 seconds. That's the limit for auto-animate, a 5-second duration. And go back to preview with the selected artboard, and you just get a slower animation. Okay? You guys want to see my favorite animation example of all time? It's so fun. I applaud the person who built it because it took a while. But check this out. Doesn't look like much, right? If I zoom in, though, no, sorry, I don't want you to say anything. Go away. You can see there's a bunch of little objects here that act as little stars. I'll go back into my preview mode, command return. Shut up. Isn't that cool? So the trick to do that again is, in this case, I actually would do the reverse. Organize the circles in the final form you want them, duplicate that artboard, and then just start moving a lot of circles for hours to distribute those. Or use a plugin called Arrange, which I'll show you later, that does smart arrangement for you automatically without all the tedious work. Anyway, that's just another example of how powerful Auto-Animate can be to do simple animations, or even more complex. Okay, so we got that. Let's talk about Repeat Grid. Some stuff that you probably know about Repeat Grid, and then we'll get into stuff that you maybe don't know about Repeat Grid. All right, so let's select these two artboards. We'll zoom up to view. And you can see on the left, this is what I want this design to end up looking like. And I want to create that very quickly. So I've created a component, if you will, for what I want to have in my grid of repeated elements. I've got all these objects selected in a group. Let's go ahead and zoom up a little bit. And now I want to repeat them. So if you go to the Properties panel, there's a button there called Repeat Grid. I just always use the keyboard shortcut, Command or Control R. And that puts a special bounding box and set of handles on that selection now that you've turned Repeat Grid on. Think of it as a special group now. So if I want more instances of that, I just drag a handle down to repeat that element. And if I drag it to the right, I can repeat it there as well. Your pizza's ready. Okay, so that's creating the repeated elements. Most of you knew that already. And then what we want to do is we want to populate the repeat grid with actual content. A couple ways to do that. I'm going to show you the most efficient way. Over on my desktop, I've got a folder of all the images that I want to use for the avatars. So I'm just going to go ahead and select those three. And I'm just going to drag and drop into the first one. And it's going to populate those circles with those particular images. Same thing with the cards. I'll select those three images and drag them into the first representative image, and it populates those as well. And then I can even do it with text. There's a text placeholder here. You'll see that says name for every single card. I'll actually want to use real data there. So I'm going to go back out to my desktop again, and I've got just a simple text file. I'll double click on it. It's just a return limited document. Every line is on its own, or every piece of information is on its own line. So just three names there. And I can just drag that text onto one of the replacement placeholders there, and it's going to populate that with the real data there. So it makes it very quick to create content like this in a repetitive grid-like fashion. Okay, that's great. You probably knew that already. Okay. You got to make me work harder for this one. So repeat grid can also be used just to generate content that you don't intend to populate, right? How many of you did, back in my day, we did step and repeat, and we liked it, right? Command D for duplicate, move it, Command D, 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 select all again, move it down, Command D, 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 D again, right? Okay. So repeat grid can be used for that type of workflow as well. Again, Command R, Control R, just drag out the grid of content that you want. And if I want to change the spacing between each grid, I just hover in between the gaps and click and drag to actually change the spacing. I can tighten them up. I can make them even have negative padding if I want to create some interesting artwork. Okay, it's up to you. Let me add some more space there again. Okay, so pretty handy, but how do you control the objects individually? So if I select one of these circles, let's say I want this one to be blue instead of red. If I dive into that repeat grid and choose that particular specific object and then go change its fill, you'll see they all change, okay? Because think of these as, you know, they're all sharing the same master, so to speak, right? They're all basically the same element, just repeated. So if you edit one of them, it edits all of them, okay? That's not what you want sometimes. So two ways to address that. You can do one of two things. You can either select that repeat grid and simply ungroup it, so Command-Shift-G or Control-Shift-D, or if you're not a keyboard shortcut person, under the Object menu, Ungroup Grid. And now these are just individual objects again, right? And they don't have a relationship with each other. So I can go and select either one of them and change that, just that particular item, okay? So some people use repeat grid just to create the content very quickly, then they take it out of the repeat grid and just treat it as individual objects, okay? But wait, there's more. Let's do a second technique that's a little bit more powerful, and it combines repeat grid with components, right? Or some of you may know of components as symbols. So I'm going to select this circle, and I can do Command-K, or I can go to the Assets panel and choose, Create Component. I'm just going to use the keyboard shortcut, Command-K. You can tell this is a component because the bounding box changes. It's green now. And it's the master component, meaning the original, because it has a solid diamond in the upper left-hand corner, okay? If I Option drag out a copy of that, I've now got an instance of that component. I can tell that because I've got a hollow diamond, okay? So I'm going to drag out one more. So I've got two instances of this master component. And these two both have hollow diamonds because they're just copies. On this particular object, I'm going to give it a different color, and that's called an override, right? I can override just about anything of an instance and customize that different from the master. So here's just a simple color attribute. I'll just change that back to that blue. And you'll see that changes, and only that changes. Let me drag out a couple more instances of the red just to drive this home. Okay. So now if I go back to the master, the one with the solid diamond, and I change its fill color to green, only the objects that were originally red change. The blue one is left alone because that was an override, right? It doesn't belong to that particular attribute has deviated from the master. If I right-click on the instance that has an override, can you tell which one has an override other than just its appearance has changed? The little diamond now has a dot in it, okay? So the master has a solid diamond, instance has a hollow diamond, an instance with an override has a dot in the middle of that diamond in the upper left-hand corner. Just visual cues to tell you what's what. Okay? If I right-click on an instance that has an override, I can say Reset to Master, and now that disrupts, it gets rid of all the overrides that I would have put on that particular object and makes it match the master again. Okay. That was a little tangent. Now we've got a circle that's been turned into a component. And now we're going to repeat grid that. So Command-R to turn it into a repeat grid. And now, if I select any one of those particular circles in that repeat grid, or whatever it is that you're repeating, anyone know what's going to happen now? It's going to let me change just the color of that one because it's an instance of a master, right? If I want all the rest of the circles to change, I go back to the first one, which is where the master is, right? It's always repeating from the master, but it's smart enough to know when you repeat the master, it repeats them as instances, okay? So if I go back to the original corner and change that to red or purple, or I'm colorblind, I guess, all of them but the blue one changes, okay? So just some different ways to use repeat grid as just a productivity enhancement, as just to accelerate the creation of content that's repetitive. And if you do it with an instance, you actually retain control over each individual element in the repeat grid as well. Whereas if you don't do an instance, they're all shared. So if you don't use a component, they're all shared. Okay? Yay! Oh, you guys are so kind. Thank you. All right. But wait, there's more. Okay. Okay, this one is another shortcut that a lot of people miss because it's not necessarily run into unless you've tried it in, say, InDesign or Illustrator or Photoshop. You don't know that it's there in InDesign or in XD as well. Here I've got this huge image on this artboard, and I want to scale it down. I want to make it, say, 25% of this so it fits on the artboard a little bit. So in the Properties panel, you can do math. Any input field that's a numeric input field, you can do math. So I can do a slash for divide. I can do an asterisk for multiplication. I can do minus, plus, whatnot. So I'm just going to put /4 to scale that image or divide it by 4. Okay? So when you want to do precise calculations or precise transformations, just do math in the PI. Okay? All right. Let's talk about masks real quick. Masks are used quite a bit, especially when you're making components and making complex components. There's 2 different ways to create masks in XD. Let's talk about the differences here. So here I've got a shape, and I want my photograph to be masked inside that shape. So I'm just going to put the shape on top of what I want to mask. By the way, you can have as many things as you want to be masked. So you can have 27 photos that are slightly overlapping each other. The top object is just going to mask whatever else you have selected underneath that top object. Okay? So if I select these 2 objects and go to Object, Mask with Shape, or Command-Shift-M, that object now that photograph gets clipped by that shape. And I still have independent access to those 2. So if I double-click, I can reposition the image within the mask. If I select the mask, I can edit it separately, and so forth. Okay? So 2 different ways. That's the first way. The other way is just simply dragging an image into a shape from the desktop. Right? So if I go back over to my Finder, and I choose a different image, this grumpy cat, I've masked that image automatically just by dragging it in. Okay? The advantage of the mask with shape technique is that I can have multiple objects being clipped simultaneously. Right? Whereas if I'm dragging, I'm only getting the one object that I drag into that shape to be clipped. Okay? Not everyone realizes that you can actually create a text mask as well. So I have a text layer. It's a point text layer, which gives me this special handle for making the text larger or smaller without having to go to the Properties panel. We have 2 different text boxes in XD. There's an area text box and a point text box. The default, if you just click, you get a point text. If you click and drag with the text tool, you get an area text. You can toggle back and forth at any time. So I'm just in the Properties panel, just changing it to area text. And that's where I get things like line breaks and so forth. If I just switch it back to point text, then I only have one handle on that text object, and that lets me resize it from the center. So I'm going to make this nice and big. And then I want to convert this into a shape so I can use it as a mask. Right? Keyboard shortcut is Command-8, Control-8 on Windows, or under the Object menu, if I go to Path, there's Convert to Path. Same thing. Just to double-click to prove that this is now paths, if I double-click and go inside that composite, you can see the points being used to create that. So now if I want to use that as a mask, I can just go back and drag an image into it, and I've got a text mask pretty easily. And then if I want to do something tricky, like animate the image inside that mask, let's say, let's go ahead and duplicate that artboard. Let's go to prototype mode, and we'll wire up these 2 artboards. Okay, set it to Auto-Animate. Great. I'm going to go back to the first artboard, double-click inside that mask to select the image. Okay, and I can make it a lot bigger. I can maybe move it over to the left. On the second artboard, I'm going to double-click and dive into that mask again. Again, make it bigger again. And this time, move it to the right. And if I go to preview mode and click tap, I've got a moving image inside a text mask with just a couple artboards. Yay. Okay. Ever had this? You want to select some text that's below another object, and someone just tells you to click harder? Okay, fine. We just shipped this a month or so ago. It's selecting through objects. just like in other products, Adobe products, if you hold down the Command key or Control on Windows, every time you click, you're selecting the first object under the cursor. If you Command click again, you select the next object under the cursor. Command click again. You just keep drilling down into the layer stack, and you'll get to the object that you want. Okay? Command click. Wow. It's always those little ones that people like the most. All right. So again, if you just keep Command clicking, you can cycle through the layer stack. If you take a look at the layers panel, you can actually see the selection changing. All right, one little trick, if you get a text layer selected and you now want to edit that text, if you just press the Enter key, that'll put you in text edit mode, and I can change this to whatever. Click harder. All right. Okay, so Command click to select through the layer stack. Once you get to a text layer and you want to edit that particular text layer without having to rearrange the objects to get to the text, so you can double click on it and so forth, just press Enter, and Escape will deselect it. Okay? So selecting through overlapping objects. There you go. Did that, did that, did that. Okay, so let's switch gears. And if you were at the keynote, which most of you probably were, you saw that there was a gigantic announcement for XD where we added states to components, right? And the crowd went wild. Yes, component states. So let's take a look at this particular file. I highly encourage you. Now, Squarespace was down a few minutes ago, so this site might not be available at the moment. Oh, it's back up. Okay. So on the title side at the beginning of the session, I told you about letsxd.com. This is Howard Pinsky's amazing XD video tutorial site. Definitely encourage you to bookmark that. What he's starting to do now, though, is for particular videos, like on this one, the video about component states, he's actually starting to include UI kits that you can download, that you can dissect and tear apart or use as building blocks to create your own components as a kind of an accelerator to get up and running. So this is a short little 3 or 4 minute video on the basics of component states. The kit that I'm using, the document I'm in right now, that's the file you can download, so you can use it and check it out and tear it apart. So here's a good example. Here's this particular artboard. I'm just going to put it in preview mode so you can actually see what he's built here. And almost every single one of these components on this artboard is interactive. So if I have this little volume toggle and I click on the right arrow, you'll see it's changing its state to show the volume increase. Here I've got a drop-down menu. Here I've got a 2-button radio button. Here I've got a heart. I can change 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for pagination. Here's a toggle. Here's a checkbox. Here's a 3-state pill button, and so forth. You guys get the idea, right? Now, back in my day, as in 2 days ago, you had to do this in XD by creating multiple artboards, right? So here's a crazy example. This is one of my favorites. So we have a product manager on the team who's also a phenomenal designer, and he decided to recreate the Spotify UI in XD. And so if we put this artboard in preview mode, you can see there's a lot going on here. Let's put it in full screen. See, every single one of these navigation buttons on the left has a rollover or a hover state. The button has a tap state. Here I've got a flyout menu with a sub menu. Okay. Here I've got a play button that actually triggers the animation down below. I can turn on the heart. I can get rid of that. Here's another drop-down menu with their own hover states. Okay. Pretty basic stuff that you should be able to create, right? Okay. Check this out. This one artboard, to do everything that I just showed you in that artboard, would have taken over 100 artboards before Monday. Okay. So everything I just showed you is on a single artboard. What? Shut up. So if you go into prototype mode, you can see all these little wires on individual objects and see how they're not connecting to other artboards. They're self-referential wires, right? Because they're state wires instead of artboard wires, okay? So let's talk about how we actually create some of these things. It's one of my favorite examples. Okay, so if we go down to this over here, how many design system people in the room? Any design ops people that actually have to create these design systems? Okay, you're going to like this as well. So different people organize their sticker sheets in different ways. Sometimes they'll create a master component for every single state. And sometimes they'll drag, if they're smart, they'll drag instances of those and do overrides for each state of the particular component they want to create. But it's a lot of manual labor to keep those things in sync, right? What states in XD lets you do is achieve the same result by having one component. And then you can just duplicate that component on the canvas and just change the active state that's visible to show you the exploded view. Because typically in your sticker sheet, you like to show all the different states of a particular component, right? So you can still get the same effect in terms of how you lay them out, but in terms of authoring them, it's a lot easier. So here I've got a simple button. It's just a piece of text on a background shape. Okay, I'm going to select those two. I'm going to turn it into a component, Command-K. So nothing new there. Actually, there is something new. If you look in the Properties panel, there is a new line at the top called Component. And we've added that just to kind of say this is where you're going to go to manage states now. Kind of as a visual cue. And clicking that plus button on the right is the same thing as doing Command-K. So now it's a component. It gets added to my Assets panel. Here I can see it there. And I've got that green diamond to let me know that that's the master. Okay. If I look over in my Properties panel now, you'll see that once you create a component, every component has a default state automatically. Okay? It's the master state of that component. Okay? If I click the plus button next to default state, I get a pop-up where I have two choices. I can choose new state, or I have a special state called hover. And if I choose hover, I'll do that one first. XD is actually going to do all the wiring for you behind the scenes. So you don't have to go into prototype mode and actually drag out wires for the default state to the hover state and then the hover state back to the default state. It just does it for you automatically. Okay? So here I've got the hover state created. I can change its name if I want. I'm just going to keep it hover state. And what I'm going to do now is I can just change anything about this object. I can change its text. I can change its color. I can add objects to it that are not in the default state. Like you can override whatever you want. You can turn layers on and off in this particular state that are different than the default state. Really full control over what you want that hover state to look like. I'm just going to do something simple. I'll select that object, that background of the button, and I'm just going to change its color just for a light hover effect. Okay? To show you this in action, now I can go to my Properties panel, and you can see that I can switch between which state is visible on canvas just by choosing which state I want to see in the Properties panel. Okay? So I'm going back to the default. I'll go back into preview mode, Command Return, and now the hover just works. I didn't have to wire anything up. I get that effect the way I want it. Okay? And the crowd went wild. Okay. Now, you can create as many states as you want in a particular component. So you can see on this simple button here, I've got a hover state, a press state, an outline state. I'm just going to continue duplicating these. If I go back to the default state and click plus, actually, the plus button is actually going to duplicate whatever state you have selected, right? So if I want the next state to be based on hover, I select that in the Properties panel before I click plus. If I want it to be based off the default state, I'll select that, make that active, and then choose the plus button there. And now it's called state 3. I'll call it pressed. And again, I'm just going to change the fill color of the press state to something darker. And now I've got 3 states on that particular component: the default state, the hover state, and the press state. Okay? Now, if I'm creating my sticker sheet or my style guide that I want to show people and share how these things are being used, how would I lay out my sticker sheet now? I'd option drag out an instance of that component, or alt drag. You can tell it's an instance because it's got the blue diamond. And then I just change what state is visible on canvas. I'm going to go back to the original, change that to default. Click on that one and change it to hover. I'll option drag again and change it to pressed. It's all managed as one component. If I look at my assets panel, I don't see 3 separate components for each of those states. I see one component because all the states are baked into it. Which means from a design system perspective, the user can just drag out that button, go to the Properties panel, and just choose which state they want visible on canvas to start out from. Make sense? Okay. Yes. But wait, there's more. What if you could do funky things like animation between states? right? So you have what people call those micro animations, right? I've got artboard to artboard animations. Now you have state to state animations as well, okay? Because think about it, each state is kind of like its own artboard, right? So you're just animating, it's the same concept. So if I go to a different document, this one right here, this artboard here, put it in preview mode, watch what happens when I click on this heart. Oh, or the star. Oh, sexy. Do it again, do it again. Would you like to know how to do that one? Yeah. All right. So let's open up that file. There it is. Okay. So here it is pre-built. I'll go into preview again, and just so you can see it. So if I tap on it or click it, I get that animation starting. I could have also just done it on hover, right? As you hover, change the state and fire that animation. I'm going to do it as a tap or a click instead. And it's just 3 objects, okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to line up these 2 objects on top of each other. What's that top object going to be used for, that outline? It's going to be used as a mask, right? So I'm going to select all 3 of these objects. And in my default state, I don't want to see any red. So that's why that red object is below the heart, okay? I'm going to go ahead and create a mask. Mask with shape. And you'll see that red object disappears because it's outside of that outline heart. It's still there, it's just being masked. I can't see it, it's been clipped. If I dive inside of the layers panel, I see mask group. There's the heart mask, there's the heart filled, and there's the heart. Just a reminder, name your layers, makes it easier. Anyway, all right. So here is my default state of that component, right? This is what I want to look like when the user hasn't touched it. I'm going to turn that into a component, Command-K. There's the default state. I'm going to click the plus button and choose New State. Okay? And I'll name this Filled. Okay? Now in the filled state, I double-click into this particular object stack, go to the heart-filled layer, that little red thing, and I'm just going to move it up until it's completely filled. Okay, that's it. There's the filled state, there's the default state. Okay? Now we need to animate between the 2. So I'm going to go to prototype mode. There's that component. I click the little blue button to actually create a wire. I want my trigger to be tap. I want my action to be auto-animate. And I can set how much time I want to. I'll do 0.8 seconds. That's it. Go back out to design. There's the filled state. There's the default state. Open up preview. Click. Oh, did I do it wrong? What did I do wrong? Oh, I didn't trigger it? Choose state. Filled. Thank you. And you just let me fail. You didn't mention that I forgot something. I don't know about that sneak now. All right. So yes, choose which state you want to trigger. That's the final last step. Let's go back out to design mode and prototype that again. And now when I click, it does that animation from state to state. Okay? So exciting. Okay, so that's just a brief preview of components and states and animated states. I'll go back to this document here. So imagine now you've actually all gone back home this weekend, and you design system ops people, you've rebuilt your design systems and converted them to components with states, because that's just the type of anal people you are, right? So you've laid them all out, you've got your design system, and now you want people to start using that. So if I go back to my document here, I've got this all simulated here. I've got my sticker sheet, my design guide, whatever you want to call this, where I've got all my components and colors and typography laid out so that folks can actually take a look and see how everything should be used. Okay? If I want to create new projects from this style guide, I can do that pretty easily now in XD as well. The trick is to make sure that this document is a cloud document. In XD, you can create local files, or you can create cloud document files, okay? By default, every new document you create is a cloud document. When you save, you can choose it and convert it to be local. But if you make it a cloud document, that empowers collaboration between you and others, okay? So if I've got this cloud document, and I create a new document from scratch, nothing up my sleeves, Okay, click a new document. I've got an empty assets panel, right? Because it's a new doc. I'm going to click the link assets button. And it's going to ask me, okay, which cloud file do you want to link to? I want to link to my style guide, my design system, whatever, saved as a cloud document. I'm going to go ahead and choose that. And that populates my assets panel with all the assets from that design document, okay? And here's the best part. They're linked. So if I drag out a component, you see I get a little link icon, and it's green. That tells me it's current. It's current with the original version in the source document, which is this other cloud document. You guys with me so far? Okay. So if I'm building a new project from the approved design system, all I've done is I've created that design system document as a cloud doc, and I've shared it with people. You can invite people via email. You can give them the link. Once you've given them access to that, then they can load that into their assets panel and use those as reusable assets that maintain a link to their source. So if you, the owner, then go actually edit that design system, those changes get pushed to the people that are using it. Okay, you with me so far? Okay, so let's take this one step further. In this document here, I've been using those assets for these set of artboards, okay? And in this particular component, you see it's got that little green icon in the upper left-hand corner telling me it's linked to a source document. Okay, if I zoom up, I decide I don't want that to be a black background. Okay, I want to change that. Now I could choose to override it, right? I could do an override and change the color here. But if I want to actually edit the original source and make that the new design system pattern, I can right-click on any symbol that I've used, any component I've used that's linked, and say Edit in Source Document. Document doesn't have to be open. It's a cloud doc. So XD will navigate and find that file for you, open it, and select the component that you want to edit, its master version. See how it's selected? How do I zoom in and just see that component? Command, I don't know, that was 20 minutes ago. What was that? Command 3. Now I'm going to double click and change its background color to something else, maybe this orange, okay? I'm going to save it, and when I switch back to this document, you see how the link icon is now blue instead of green. So green means it's current, it's up to date. Blue means it's different than its original. And if I look in my assets panel, you'll see I've got an update button. If I hover over the blue icon for the component in the layers panel, or the assets panel, I get a live preview of what accepting that change would look like. If I zoom out, you can see everywhere that symbol is being used, that component's being used, it's updating that for me in context. And if I want to accept that change, I just click the blue link. Now they're all current, and that blue icon goes to green again. Okay? All right. Okay, I've got 6 minutes left. Shoot. How to pack 8 hours of content into an hour and 15 minutes. Okay, I'm going to skip plugins. I'm going to skip that. Okay, I'll do one more thing, and then I'll show you the sneak. Anyone have to create social media graphics and enjoys that? Yep. Would you like to learn how to do them really, really fast in XD?
Yes.
Okay. Using features that I've already taught you how to use. There's nothing new here. It's just using XD as you normally would use it, with one little caveat. All right, so I've got these two artboards here. These are my Instagram square versions of my banner ads or whatever it is that I need to create for social media. And I'm going to select this artboard and responsive resize, turn that on and scale it. And that doesn't look right, right? Hold that thought. I'm going to go to this one, do the same thing. And that's acting like it should. Anyone know the difference? This is a photo that's just been dragged into XD and made smaller. This is a photo that's been masked into a shape, okay? So when you resize images in XD, by default, images are locked. Their aspect ratio is locked. So you don't have to hold the shift key, right? When you scale, it's going to scale proportionally by default, because most of the time, that's how you want images to scale. You want them to scale proportionally, okay? That's happening because the lock icon in width and height is on by default, okay? This particular image, it's the same image, but it was masked. I created a shape, the size I wanted the image to be in, and I drag the image into the shape. Okay? Shapes with images inside them work much better with responsive resize than just photos. Okay? The only way to get the photo to act the way that you might have expected with responsive resize is to turn off the lock. But what's the downside of that? That means it's going to stretch, and that's not what you want. Okay? So when you're building these types of assets, these types of templates for social media graphics, just put your photos in a shape. That way they can scale proportionally or disproportionately, however you want to get them to go. All right, so let's build this from scratch. Here's my template. I've got my shape where I want the photograph to go real quick. I'm going to go out to my desktop, drag in the photo into that shape. Okay, there's my completed file. I'm going to open up CC Libraries because all the assets come from my brand or marketing team. So I'm going to drag out my logo, place that next to my handy-dandy guides that you know about now. I'll get my stock logo, scale that down, put it in the center, make it a little bit smaller. This took about 10 seconds to create this banner ad, right? Okay, so I've got my base template down. Now I want to create the Facebook version. So I'm going to Option drag to duplicate that graphic, and I'm going to responsive resize it. With responsive resize turned on, there's my Facebook dimensions. I'm going to Option drag again. And this time I'm going to drag that corner handle. There's my story version. How cool is that? Okay. If I had more time, I'd show you how to create an animated GIF by doing Auto-Animate between O2 Artboards, recording the preview window. I'm talking very fast, so you can look this up on your own. Auto-Animate, record the preview window. There's a little record button in the preview window that saves out a video file. Then you can use Adobe Media Encoder to convert that video file into an animated GIF. Boom. All right. But wait, one last thing. A sneak peek, as I promised. So let's open up a special build, one that you do not have access to yet, thus the sneak peek. Okay. So I've got my button here, got my design system, everything's great. I Option drag out an instance, and then you do what you do every day of your design lives. You change that button label to play. And what happens? Oh, the background didn't adjust. So I got to go double click, adjust that shape, resize it, hold down the Option key to make sure the spacing's right. It's not, 60 on one side, 55 on the other. Dang it, nudge it 5 pixels. Repeat that 500 times a day, right? Oh, and by the way, I have to do that for each state. Like, screw that, okay? Would you like that to be a different workflow? All right, so I'm going to use this button instead. And all I've done, notice in the Properties panel, there's a new section called Layout. And again, in case you're not paying attention, this is not in XD yet. This is a sneak peek. It's coming. There's this little checkbox called Adaptive Background. It's been turned on for this particular group, okay? I'm just going to change the text to play now. Shut up. But wait, there's more. Let's do something a little bit more complex. So this is a group, right? It's not even a component yet. By the way, all this behavior will be wrapped up into the component so that when you have your button component in your design system and the first thing they need to do is drag out an instance of that and then change the label, the padding will stay consistent automatically, okay? Here it is. I've got my group turned on, this group, and in this layout section, I've got adaptive background turned on. I can turn it off, and then it just doesn't do anything smart. Like I can drive that around and nothing happens. With this group selected, I'm going to turn adaptive background turned on, and you'll see that XD is automatically detecting the padding of the space between the contained elements and the background shape. And if I double click and dive into that group, you see that dotted line? That's where it's calculating the padding from. So if there's a background shape that extends beyond the rest of the objects in the group, it automatically detects the padding. Now, you'll be able to hold down a modifier key and actually edit the padding on canvas. If I hold down Shift in the modifier key, I can do all 4. If I do Option, I can just do mirroring. But if I extend the content, or change the layout of the content, or add another component to that content?
No way.
What? Coming to an XD near you. Okay. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and enthusiasm. Enjoy the rest of Max. See you out there. One last request. Please fill out your session evaluations in the Adobe Max app. We really pay attention to those. We read every single one of them. Enjoy the rest of Max. Thank you.